Hey everybody, welcome to this week's live chat. I'm Angela Walters and I'm glad you're joining me. If you're joining live, be sure to type your questions as I'm talking because Jessica's here, as always, writing them down so I can answer them at the end. And if you're not watching live, no worries, you can leave any questions in the comments. I'm super excited to join you on another Thursday afternoon outside of Kansas City, Missouri, where the temperature is plummeting. I think winter is coming. Which is perfect quilting time, perfect free motion quilting time for the upcoming challenge. So in this live chat, I just want to talk a little bit about the basic supplies you're going to need for free motion quilting and participating in the challenge. Now I know not everybody watching is going to quilt along with me in the upcoming video series, and that's totally fine. But even if you're wanting to tiptoe into machine quilting, this will give you kind of the basics to get you going. First of all, real quick, Susan Nielsen is the winner from last week's live chat where I gave away the fat quarter bundle. So Susan, be sure to email us and we'll get that sent out to you. Also, let's talk about the upcoming challenge before we get to the supplies. Last week's live chat, I gave all the details, all the fun stuff about that. Just a reminder, it's going to start December 6th. So on December 6th is when that first video will come out here on YouTube. You can also check out my website. And during that video, I'll show you how to quilt a technique or a part of the quilt, and then we'll have a live chat to follow up. So once we get going, basically every week part of this class will be coming out and we'll be having fun quilting together. So be sure to check that out if you want. And be sure to subscribe because this is when you get the email saying that it's there. All right, when it comes to machine quilting supplies though, it's like any other thing, I guess, that we do. There's so many options that sometimes it can be overwhelming or even like kind of intimidating to know where to start. So whether you are machine quilting on your sewing machine or your long arm, there are a few basic things that will give you the best result. And so we're going to talk through some of my favorite things, but I just want to add this little caveat real quick that this is just my opinion. There are notions out there that you might like better. There might be notions that I show that you don't love. Just know that this is what works for me. As you grow in your machine quilting journey, you'll be able to kind of experiment and find what works for you. So if you're going to be quilting along with me on the challenge, on the video series, or you're going to try machine quilting, well, of course, you're going to need a sewing machine. Seems pretty obvious. Or a long arm quilting machine. Here's the thing about the sewing machines. I know that sometimes we think if we just had the next bigger, better thing, it would go easier, and that may be the case, but I feel like most quilters don't use the machine they have to its full capability. So even if you have a little sewing machine or a machine that you're like, oh, it's not like a big long arm, it's still going to be fine. Now, hopefully it has the ability to drop the feed dogs, because when we start machine quilting, we're not letting those feed dogs pull the fabric. Our hands are taking over for us. That's the fun part. However, if you can't drop your feed dogs, you can always cover them up with a Supreme slider, which we'll see here in a little bit, or with something just to cover those up. So you're gonna need your sewing machine, just nice and whatever you have laying around, of course. And then if you have a long arm, that will work as well. Now let's talk about the feet for your sewing machine. So you might hear a free motion quilting foot. It might be called a different name. Check with your sewing machine manufacturer to see what it is. It could be a darning foot, a free motion foot, a quilting foot, and you'll probably have seen there's a couple different options, you know, different feet. Honestly, the foot you should use is the one that you have, but if you have a couple of different options that you can pick from, I always like to leave my ruler foot on my machine. So the ruler foot, it's just a free motion quilting foot with a higher attachment down here so that I can quilt with my ruler. If you don't plan on using rulers or you have a bunch of different feet, you're not sure what to pick from, go with something round. I like a little bit of roundness to my foot. Sorry, it's like, ooh, there we go. Because the distance between the needle and the edge of the foot is the same all the way around that foot, and that's going to help me with my echoing. Now, you might see something like this, plastic, or maybe it's like a little dynamic foot, something that kind of hops. This little guy is great if you're working on a quilt with bulky seams, like t-shirt quilts or quilts like I've pieced that aren't pieced super well, so the seams are bulky, because it gives it a little bit of a hop. But you can't necessarily use a ruler with this, and the echoing isn't quite there. So since we're going to be quilting on a panel, your regular round foot or your ruler foot, you can leave on there if you want. Or if you're like, this is the only foot I've got, well, that's the foot that you use. Makes it pretty easy, right? Again, if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments and we'll address those. The best thing to do is to check with your sewing machine manufacturer to see what to use. So those of you that have newer machines, probably pretty easy to figure out. But if your machine's a little bit older and you're not sure which foot it is or how to find it, check with your manufacturer, because even within the same manufacturer, the machines are different. So I can't unfortunately give you a set answer for all that. But you're going to need some kind of foot that's going to hover over your quilt sandwich so that you can move it smoothly and make the beautiful designs that we're going to be making in our challenge. All right, so besides that, actually this list isn't very long, so we're almost, we're getting there to the end, but thread. So thread's very important. That's what we're going to be quilting with. Now, when it comes to machine quilting with thread, this is a whole nother subset of things that you can choose from. There are so many types of threads, so many colors, so many kinds of thread. There's a lot of different options. The most important thing is you want to use thread that is made for machine quilting. This is so important because the thread has to be strong enough to handle the stress of the machine going in all different directions on a long arm, or the fabric going all different directions on a sewing machine. So you need to check and make sure that it's meant for machine quilting. I always tell my long arm owners when I'm training them, if it works, it works. So if you have thread laying around and you're not sure if it's going to work, try it. And if it's not breaking and it's working, that's fine. But if you're quilting with thread that isn't meant for machine quilting, you're going to see a lot of breaking thread and shredding thread, because as it's going through that fabric and moving in that different rates of speed, that's when the weaknesses really show. Now, beyond that, as long as it's made for machine quilting, you're going to be set and good to go. However, if you can, I always suggest, and this is just a rule of thumb, I always suggest 40 to 50 weight thread. Now the weight of the thread will be on the end of the cone or the spool, you can see it there. And the reason I suggest the 40 or 50 weight is because I feel like it's kind of right in the middle. It's not so thin that it's finicky and you have to quilt slower, and it's not so thick that it's gonna show up a lot on your quilt. So that 40 to 50 weight is just a good middle of the road. I think it's thin enough, it kind of blends in still, but still strong enough to handle the machine quilting. So this particular quilt is glide thread, it's poly, but Aurifil, 100% cotton thread can work as long as it's quality thread. Anything like that. The results you're gonna get from the quilting is gonna be it's gonna be such a better experience if you have that high quality thread. If you have thread laying around that maybe isn't high quality, that's gonna be better for piecing. In general, I'm so worried now, Jessica, I'm going to get all these hate emails. Like, in general, like how I mitigate in general, piecing is fine because it's only going in one direction and it's holding it there. So I can't stress that enough. Cannot stress it enough. So when I say like machine quilting thread, let's say you have an embroidery machine and you have a lot of beautiful embroidery thread laying around and it's rayon and it looks beautiful. Well, even though it's quality thread, it might not be made for machine quilting. So again, if you're struggling with the quilting process, make sure that you're using good thread. What I don't want for you all is to have any newer quilters finally bite the bullet, finally say, great, I'm gonna give this a shot. Angela says that it's gonna be fine, and then you get the thread, start quilting, and you have thread breaks. It's so frustrating to deal with that. So I will stop beating that dead horse right now, but just know that thread is very, very, very important. And kind of on that same vein, that same thing, needles. So the needle that you're going to use really depends on the type of thread. So the size of needle depends on the type of thread that you're using. The way the needles are put together, or the way they work, is the eye of the needle is different sizes depending on the type of thread you use. If you think about it, if I'm machine quilting with a thicker thread, I'm going to need a needle with a larger eye so that I can quilt and not have any of those shredding threads. If you're working on a sewing machine, sit-down machine, or where you're moving the fabric, it's not industrial long arm, I love the titanium coated needles. Now, the reason I think they're so great is they're stronger, and if we're new to free motion quilting, one tendency is to really kind of push the quilt even though the machine isn't quilting quickly, and that's where we can see bent needles. And even if it's deflected just a bit, just a little bit that's not even noticeable, the results can be shredding thread and breaking thread. Again, all very, very frustrating when you're learning how to quilt. So, of course, if you just have some other thread or the needles laying around, that's fine. You don't have to get the titanium coated one, but please make sure that the needle you're using is going to fit the thread that you're using as well. Again, that's just going to give you a better experience all around. So you can check out the package and it will tell you For instance, this 90 to 14 needles just says right on there, it's great for medium threads, 40 weight. So it's going to be great for that. If you're using quality thread and you aren't sure about the needle size and you're seeing a lot of shredding, especially at the eye of the needle, it could be that you have the wrong size. Now, if you're working on a long arm, you're going to use your manufacturer's suggested long arms or needles. So for instance, Handy Quilter, which is what I use, has Handy Quilter needles. Just go ahead and use the brand that is supposed to be used for your machine. It's going to save you a lot of angst. And most needle packs will tell you on the back what size to go with. Now, here's the fun thing about thread, and I love talking about thread, and I won't go on and on about it because I know not everybody loves it as much as I do. There's no standard weight definition across the industry. Isn't that fun? That means a 50 weight cotton thread can be a different thickness than a 50 weight poly. So if you're looking at your needles and there's kind of like an overlap, like maybe this one does 40, but this one does as well, you can kind of try them both. But for the most part, use that as a starting point and make sure that you have the right needle, the right size. So that's going to help save you just so much frustration as you're quilting. Again, because what I don't want to do is finally get you to give this a shot and then have you get mad at me because it's not going smoothly. Okay, one thing that's not on here as far as like required supplies, you're going to need a quilt sandwich to quilt along, of course. So if you're quilting along with me, if you want to get the custom panel I put together for the challenge, super appreciate that. The link to all that stuff that I'm talking about is in the description box. Or you can just make a quilt sandwich, put your layers together of any fabric that you have laying around. But as an incentive, we are offering buttons if you purchase the mandala panel. We actually sold out of our first run, like sold so many panels, our first run's gone, but we're going to order some more because they're so cute. So if you buy the panel, you don't need a promo code. We'll throw it in while supplies last. So if you're tempted to get the panel, maybe a little pin will push you over the edge. I don't know. Just kind of fun there. So you're gonna need a quilt sandwich. If you're working on your sewing machine, you can baste your quilt sandwich in the method you prefer. So this is a question I get so often. How do I do it? Do I use pins? Do I use fusible spray, fusible batting? Ultimately, whatever you do use is fine. I like fusible batting, but just baste it in your preferred method. So that's the main gist of that. Now, that's the basics you need to get started. Like, there's no excuse to not give it a try, right? You're like, I've got some needles laying around, I've got some thread, I've got some fabric, let me give it a shot. But there are some optional supplies that might help you out a little bit, especially if you're newer to machine quilting or if you're like me. So I love the Supreme Slider. So let's talk about this. The Supreme Slider, and those of you that have been quilting a while probably already know this, right? It's like a Teflon sheet that's nice and smooth. And it goes on the bottom of your sewing machine so that your fabric moves nice and, well, smoother than it would on your machine. It kind of gives it like that glide kind of surface. It's also nice because if you don't have the capability to put down your feed dogs, you can cover them up with this. So you can cover them up. Again, this is not required. And what's funny is, when I go out and teach, I find that, maybe it's like half and half. Half of quilters use this, half don't. When I learned how to machine quilt on a sewing machine, I had went from hand quilting to quilting on a long arm. And then I learned how to quilt on a sewing machine. So I needed all the help I could get because I wasn't used to the whole smush and push of moving it around. There are other things you can get, not just Supreme Slider. I know that some people are probably chiming in the comments. There's some spray you can put down or some other sliders, just basically something to kind of give me less friction when I'm trying to move that quilt through there. So I love my Supreme Slider. All right, next, and this is kind of half and half too. Not everybody loves them. I love quilting with my gloves. Again, I think it's just because I needed every little tool when I was learning how to quilt on my sewing machine. So the gloves are going to help you on the sewing machine. I should say these are just for the sewing machine, not the long arm. The gloves help me hold on to the quilt a little bit more, help me get a little bit more grab to it, especially if you're working on larger quilts and you're fighting it. It just kind of helps give you a little bit more grip. Gardening gloves, I know some people like those. There's stuff you can put on your hands. But if you find that you're having a hard time holding on to it or a hard time really maneuvering it, and you can maybe look into getting some gloves. I like these because I call them my sexy gloves, but anything that has grip on the back. And it's funny, when I teach classes, I see all sorts of things, right? Gloves with the fingertips cut off, gloves with them on, whole fingers off, just whatever you like. You're going to find it very helpful. All right, separate from free motion quilting, you're like, okay, this is just what I need to get to quilting, a couple things I'm using on the challenge panel, or a couple things that I'm going to be working with that are not required. It's not required for the challenge, but it might be nice. So I did use a Smiley ruler, which is one of my rulers with creative grids for arcs. So the center of this quilt, if I kind of show you the center of that, has a lot of echoes, and we're doing a lot of curves, right, with that kind of mandala kind of shape. And so that's just going to help me get that nice smooth curve. If you have an arc ruler already, great. If you don't, no worries. You don't have to have one. But this is something I used in the beginning. And then also Taj. So Taj, again, another ruler I have with creative grids, using that to help me do some kind of pointed echoes. So if you have these rulers, go ahead and find them, pull them out. Or if you're wanting them, you can click the link in the description box below. But again, they are not required. If you have something similar, it's going to work. Or if not, we're just going to learn how to free motion it and work through it. So the Smiley and the Taj ruler are going to be kind of the supplies I use throughout most of the panel. There's not much more besides that. Now, if you're quilting on a long arm, if you're quilting along with me, one other optional supply that you'll need is a ruler base and a ruler foot. So if you're going to be trying those rulers out on that long arm, definitely going to need a ruler base. Again, you want to check with your manufacturer to see what they suggest for that. So that's it. My goal when I'm putting together the video series is not to have a bunch of things you have to track down. I just had a thought. I'm like the Rachel Ray of quilting, right? Like the 30-minute meals. I don't want you to have to go to the store and get some special thing, but these are the basics to get going, and then we're going to have fun quilting through that stuff. Now, again, I want to just reiterate, I know some of you might have other stuff that you prefer. That's great, and you should leave them in the comments, because I know that there's nothing quilters love more than seeing other quilters, notions and stuff. But these are the things that I'm regularly reaching for when I'm quilting. So do we have any questions? Usually that leads to some good general FMQ questions. All right, so next week we're going to talk about how we're going to approach the panel, how I'm going to handle this if I'm doing it on a sewing machine versus a long arm, as far as if I were participating. And one of the things I'll talk about is where we're going to start free motion quilting, which just happens to be the first question on here. So when I'm working on a sewing machine, do I start free motion quilting in the center and work my way out, or from bottom to top? And the answer to that, if you've watched some of my live chats, you know what I'm going to say. It depends. It really depends. If you're working on a sewing machine, you can start anywhere you want on the quilt. If your quilt sandwich is basted, you're good to go. However, usually I start in the center and work my way out, because the bulkiest part is in the center, right? The hardest part, where I've got the most quilt hanging everywhere, and I usually like to go ahead and get that part tackled before I get bored with the project. But if I don't know what I want to do in the center, or it makes more sense to start somewhere else, you can definitely do that as well. So that's the cool thing. You can start wherever you want. If you're like, I don't know where I want, then just start in the center and we'll call it good. However, on a long arm, we're going to treat this a little different, because on a long arm, I'm kind of thinking top down in rows a little bit. So I'm going to be working my way down the quilt, but it might not be from the top of the quilt to the bottom. I might load it sideways. So it just depends on how I need to work around that. All right. I should have talked about this, another thread question. I love thread questions. What thread weight do you use in the bobbin? I want to pause and say you can use any thread in the bobbin. It doesn't have to match the top. It doesn't have to be the same type or the same kind, especially if you have the ability to set the tension on your bobbin. On long arms, that's usually the case. The thread weight I will be using on my long arm is a 60 weight thread in the bobbin, because that's a pre-wound. And on the sewing machine, I'll be using I think it's a 40 or 50 weight pre-wound in the bobbin as well. Ultimately, though, it's up to you. I did pick a backing for the panel that's dark and it's purple and it's so colorful that we're not going to see the quilting on the back very much anyway. So you can play around with that and see what you prefer. I wish there was like a set answer, but there's not. It really just depends. Would I use a slider on the long arm ruler foot table as well? No. So I should have specified the slider is just for the sewing machine. If you think about it, when I'm quilting on a sewing machine, I'm taking this big quilt sandwich and I'm doing the smush and push, right? I'm smushing it down, smushing it in, and trying to quilt. And sometimes that can be difficult, because I gotta really get it in there. On a long arm, that machine is set up on the rail so that it should move so smoothly with just your fingertips, right? So we don't need any more movement to that point. So not for the long arm, just for the sewing machine. Will Archie work for Smiley? Yes. So Archie, I don't think I have one of them right here. I got the whole crew hanging out. Well, Archie's another ruler I have with creative grids, and it's just a smaller arch. It will work. In a previous Free-motion challenge, I talked about how we can take smaller rulers and fit bigger areas, and so maybe I'll try to touch on that during the video live chat. But yeah, you can definitely use that instead if you'd like. All right, great questions. I love when you ask questions live. I like getting ready to address them live.
Can you talk about when the shipping will happen?
Oh, when the shipping will happen. We've had a question right up there. Okay, so right now the panels for the Free-motion challenge are in pre-order status. That means they haven't started shipping yet. But they are in, and we're cutting. In fact, Jessica and I have a cutting date tomorrow all day. It's going to be fun. So they should ship when? Next week? End of next week, probably? End of next week. So in plenty of time for you to get it in time for the challenge to start and make your quilt sandwich and get going. So yeah, it's very exciting. It looks like a rainbow threw up in our cutting room. Lots of color everywhere. So yes, challenge will start the 6th. Shipping of those panels will start very soon. Be sure to order yours if you want to quilt along with me, and we'll get to do that together. All right, so next week, again, I'll be talking a little bit about how do you approach a quilt, working your way through a quilt. This is going to be a little bit more like higher level, not higher level, difficult, but kind of more abstract. It's not going to be, here's how we quilt a swirl. It's like, how do I approach this quilt? How am I going to quilt it in a way that is efficient? And so we're going to talk about the differences depending on the machine you're on, and of course, answer your questions live. I cannot wait. So every Thursday, 3 p.m. Central, I will see you there. Until then, everybody stay safe, especially those of you that are in the South with the hurricane coming in. Please stay safe, and I will see you